Hi, everyone. Welcome to another segment in our chapter on aggregate expenditures. In this segment, we're going to add foreign exchange to our model. Now, we started with AE. We added consumption and investment. That was our simple model. In the previous segment, we added the government sector. And in this segment, we add the foreign sector, which is net exports. And net exports are equal to exports minus the level of imports. So let's add this one to our model. So add the foreign sector. You'll notice that this has surprising similarities to when we added the previous sectors to our models. We're going to talk about autonomous and induced again. So what we're going to do first is focus on our exports. How are our exports influenced? And primarily, it has to do with foreign incomes. So when foreign incomes increase, spending on Canadian exports increases. And likewise, when foreign incomes decrease, spending on Canadian exports decreases. So we assume and put in our model that these are 100% autonomous, just like government spending was 100% autonomous, because we don't control foreign incomes. However, with spending on imports, Canadian imports, when Canadian incomes increase and it's Canadian incomes increase, then people will want to buy more imports. So there's an autonomous component to that. You'll see that there's an induced component to that. You'll see that there's also an autonomous component to imports. And we'll build the formula for that quickly on the next page. But first, the autonomous component is hugely influenced by something called the marginal propensity to import. Very similar in concept to the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal tax rate, the marginal propensity to expend. This is just the marginal propensity to import. And it's the change in imports resulting from a change in income. So we write it as MPM, and we just say here, delta IM, change in imports, over change in income is the marginal propensity to import. And it's going to influence the autonomous component of our import function. So we can build our import function fairly quickly here because we've done these similarly before. First, we'll notice that exports are entirely autonomous. Imports are have an induced component because they rise. Okay, and this is going to be net exports. We're going to dissect that in detail in a moment or two. But right now, all we want to do is notice that when income is 0, imports start at 40. And then as income increases, say here by 100, our imports increase by 10. And if you were to click back to the previous slide, you would say the marginal propensity to import, or the MPM, is 10 over 100. So it's 0.1. Imports increase by 0.1 of national income increases. So we can actually pull out our formula right now. Imports are equal to 40, that's the autonomous component, plus 0.1y, that's the induced component. Now let's show this just really clearly by itself on the next slide. There's our imports, 40, which is the autonomous component, plus 0.1y, that's the induced component, of which 0.1 is the marginal propensity to import. That creates the induced component. And that was what we showed in the formula when we calculated it a little bit earlier. Now, we said we were going to introduce net exports because we want to look at not exports alone or imports alone, but the combination of both of them together. One's a leakage and one's an injection, so we have to net them out or subtract them. And it's also called the balance of trade. You'll hear this term a lot. The balance of trade or net exports means the same thing. And its formula is just XN is equal to exports minus imports. And if you always calculate it that way, exports minus imports, then the plus or minus sign you get will have significant meaning and consistent meaning. So sometimes it's written as X little n is exports minus imports. So let's take a look at the table of those and pull out a little bit more meaning. Okay, on the left, we have our standard income range starting at 0 and rising to 800, covering the whole stretch there. And we see that exports are 100% autonomous, means they stay at 100 because it's foreign incomes and foreigners' income that buys our exports. So we don't have any control over that. So in our model, we say it's autonomous. And imports have the autonomous component of 40, plus they rise at 10 for every 100 incomes rising, so there's the induced component there too. To calculate net exports, I said previously, always start with exports. So 100 minus 40 is plus 60. And you go all the way down, and I'll just go to here, 100 minus 90 is plus 10. So everywhere it's positive, that means we've got a positive balance of payments, or positive net exports, or a balance of payments surplus, or a net export surplus. So understand those terms. And then at this point, 100 minus 100 is 0. Well, we've got a balanced net exports, or a balanced balance of payments. There's no excess. And then if we continue and income goes higher, well, imports are going to go higher as well. So when we subtract exports, still 100, notice it's autonomous, minus imports, we end up with negative numbers here. This one's minus 20. And that means there's a balance of payments deficit, or an net exports deficit. It means exports are less than imports in this particular case. So if you always calculate exports minus imports, you can't go wrong. The sign will be very meaningful to you. Now, the last thing we talk about in this little segment, and it was a quick one, right? Because we've already done this stuff similarly for all the previous segments. But what affects net exports? And we did these in the class previously, so I'll just skim over them. Well, comparative price levels will affect net exports. Remember, net exports is exports minus imports. And that means, well, what if Canadian price levels are relatively higher? Well, our exports will go down and our imports will go up. People will not want to buy our products as much because our prices are higher. And locals will not want to buy our prices as much. Maybe they'll start importing goods. So it affects the balance of trade, net exports. The value of exchange rate. So I'll just do one side of this again too. If our exchange rate gets stronger, in other words, our dollar gets more valuable, then our exports will go down because people have to buy our currency first, and their currency won't be able to buy as much of our currency because our dollar is appreciated. It's got strong. So our exports will go down. And of course, when our dollar is stronger, it makes it cheaper for us to buy internationally because we're buying now relatively cheaper exchange, international exchange, to buy their products. So the value of the exchange rate directly affects net exports as well. Income levels abroad, well, that's pretty clear. As income levels abroad go down, they go into recession, they'll buy less of our exports, right? They'll buy less of everybody's exports. So exports will go down as income levels abroad go down. And then the last one's kind of a catch-all, foreign tastes. Well, what happens if people just decide that they love to buy Canada? They think there's good quality goods here. They want to buy Canadian, or they like the products. Well, foreign tastes, if they happen to be in favor of Canadian products, our exports will go up, right? And if they happen to be against Canadian products, our exports will go down. So go back and review these determinants of net exports. But now we've added the fourth and final sector to our model. And in our next segment, we're going to tie it all together and do the full expenditure model, the full aggregate expenditure model. And you'll see that everything we do, we've already done with the simple model, but now we add government spending and net exports.